Hello, my name is Taylor Elwood, your occult author and host of MagicalExperiments.com. Today we're going to talk a little bit further about identity and magic. So last time I talked about identity being the agreement you have with the universe. I want to unpack that a bit because that word agreement is admittedly a loaded word. When people hear the idea of agreement, they might think, well, wait a minute, are you saying I consciously chose to be unemployed? That I consciously chose this disease? That I consciously chose these negative experiences? And the answer to that is no, not necessarily. And you may not have even unconsciously chosen that per se, but at the same time it's worth taking a look at. When I talk about the agreement with the universe, what I'm really talking about is this fundamental connection with the universe at large. We don't exist independently of the universe. We exist in tandem with the universe. We exist in tandem with this planet. We exist in tandem with everybody else, whether we realize it or not. In fact, one of the really compelling arguments for that is really comes right down to the fact that we can't live off of this planet indefinitely. We can't live in outer space. We can't live on other planets as of yet because we haven't really found other planets that enable that. We are codependent or symbiotically dependent on this planet, although it could be argued that this planet is not dependent upon us and doesn't really need us. The concept of the agreement with the universe is really examining the idea that a person's identity is formed in part around points of tension within him or herself that he or she wishes to avoid, but also around experiences that she/he may need to have. These choices, these experiences, these tension points are not necessarily always chosen by the person, but nonetheless they would not be there if there was not some fundamental need for them. And that fundamental need for those experiences, for those tension points, for those things is what shapes the person for better or for worse. Now, any one of us would no doubt say that none of us would choose to be raped. I certainly wouldn't choose to be raped, and I don't think anyone else would. And having been a rape survivor, I can say that with some degree of authority and say that it's not something I ever would have chosen. But having had that experience, I then also have the realization of how I can choose to handle it, how I can choose to deal with it. And changing the agreement with the universe, changing your identity, really involves learning to unpack everything within yourself that defines who/what you are and change the definition. There's a really good book called Defining Reality by Edward Schiappa. It's not a book about magic, it's a book about definitions. However, it's a book that I would recommend to any magician who's really serious about his or her work. And the reason for that is because it's really a book that examines the role of definitions in our lives. And when you take it outside of just the linguistic context and you look at it from a cultural context, you look at it from a personal context, you begin to realize that definitions are something that inform the reality of our lives in so many different ways. And so when I talk about the agreement with the universe, I'm really talking about the definitions that we have chosen on some level to have. Now, some of those definitions, such as having a disease, you don't necessarily choose that definition per se, but having it defines your life. So you can't, and if you can't get rid of the disease, how you choose to respond to that disease also defines your life, both on unconscious and conscious levels. So really, when I talk about the agreement with the universe, I'm talking about the definitions that structure our approach to life. how we define ourselves, how we label ourselves, etc., etc. And I would argue that for magic to be truly effective, we have to learn how to change the labels and definitions that we provide ourselves, more so than anything else. Because those definitions, those labels, are how we tend to think of ourselves. If you label yourself a magician, guess what? You have labeled yourself. If you call yourself a magician, if you name yourself a magician, you have named, you have called, you have defined yourself as a magician. But what does that really mean then? That means that you have a particular label associated with you, and how you choose to define it really defines the reality of it for you and the reality of its effect on your life. So let's say you do have a disease. You know what? It sucks. It's horrible. You don't want to have it, but you have it. And worse, it's a terminal disease. What can you do about it? You can give up. You can accept that you're going to die at some point. Well, we all have to accept that regardless, but you can accept that you'll die sooner than later. You can choose to fight it, and you can also choose to really examine what it means to have that disease and ask yourself how it defines your life. Now, you can't argue with the fact that a disease will define your life in certain physical ways that may not, that medicine might be able to alleviate, but might not be able to change. Fair enough. But how do you choose to respond even to those conditions? That is something you have control over. My argument in regards to identity is simply this, that as we learn what identity is, as we look at the definitions and the labels within our lives, what we are able to really do is start empowering ourselves, start to make changes for ourselves. You might have a disease. You might live in less than ideal circumstances. I'm not going to argue that sucks and that sometimes it's not fair to what people have to deal with. But what you have control over is the definitions and the labels that are associated with those different experiences and how you choose to respond. And if you want to make changes, you first have to change what the definitions and labels mean to you. You can't really effectively make changes within your identity if you're not willing to change at a fundamental level the way that you conceptualize or approach the world. You will, if you can't make those changes, then anything you try to change above that will not work, because you're running up against those core beliefs, those core definitions, those core labels that you've created that help you define your place in this universe, in this world. That's what I mean by agreement with the universe. Next time we're going to talk further about how to make those changes to definitions and look a bit further at what the concept of definition really means and how it relates to magic. For those of you who are interested, I would highly recommend picking up Defining Reality by Edward Schiappa. Excellent book. Realistically, it's the first book I would make anyone who wants to practice magic, or anyone who's experienced at it but came to me and asked me for learning. That's the first book I would assign them to read, because frankly it beats out all of the magical books out there. Yes, that includes Uncle Al's books as well. I think that Defining Reality allows you to learn how to define your own definition of magic as opposed to relying on someone else's. And that, my friends, is true art and science. Thanks very much for watching.